The billionaire invited her as a joke, but when she entered like a goddess, the entire room fell silent. Chicago at night has a personality of its own. The wind coming off Lake Michigan moved through the downtown streets like a quiet reminder that the city never really sleeps. Glass towers reflected thousands of lights, each window holding its own story. From a distance, the skyline looked calm and powerful at the same time. High above those lights, inside one of Chicago's most expensive hotels, the Aurora Foundation Gala had already begun. Crystal chandeliers hung over a ballroom filled with wealth, influence, and carefully rehearsed confidence. Conversations drifted through the room like soft music. Investors discussed markets. Executives compared strategies. Cameras flashed near the entrance as prominent guests arrived. And at the center of that world stood Theodore. He leaned comfortably against the polished bar, a glass resting loosely in his hand. The kind of man people recognized instantly when he entered a room. Early 40s, sharp suit, calm posture, a reputation built from a billion-dollar tech company that had grown faster than anyone expected. People respected Theodore. Some admired him. Others simply understood that when a man controlled that much money and influence, it was easier to stay on his good side. Around him, a small circle of wealthy friends laughed easily. They spoke the language of people who had spent years believing the world was theirs to shape. One of them raised his glass. "To another successful year," he said. Theodore smirked. "I'll drink to that." Their laughter blended with the soft jazz playing near the stage. Waiters moved smoothly between tables carrying silver trays of champagne. The night felt polished, predictable, exactly the way powerful people like their events to feel. But across the city, another moment was unfolding. Several miles away, in a quiet apartment overlooking the Chicago River, Ilana stood in front of a mirror. Her building wasn't loud or extravagant, just one of the many elegant residential towers that lined the river, where the view of downtown felt close enough to touch, but far enough to remain peaceful. The city lights reflected softly through the window behind her. Ilana adjusted the edge of a dark dress draped across her shoulders. The fabric fell smoothly, simple in design, but graceful in the way it followed her movement. She wasn't someone who dressed to demand attention. Her style reflected the same thing her personality did, confidence without noise. Her eyes met her own reflection. Calm, focused, the kind of calm you usually only see in someone who has already lived through moments that force them to grow stronger. On the small table beside her rested a single envelope. Cream-colored, elegant, formal, the kind of invitation most people would frame once in their lifetime. She picked it up again, reading the words slowly even though she had already memorized them. Aurora Foundation Gala, hosted by Theodore, the same Theodore currently laughing with his friends in the ballroom across the city. Two people, two very different rooms, two very different expectations for the night ahead. In the ballroom, Theodore lifted his drink again as another round of laughter passed through his circle. In the quiet apartment, Ilana folded the invitation carefully and placed it back on the table. Outside her window, Chicago stretched across the darkness, alive with movement and possibility. Neither Theodore nor the crowd surrounding him had any idea what was about to walk into their perfectly arranged evening. And Ilana knew something else they didn't. Tonight wasn't just another charity gala. Tonight was a lesson waiting to happen. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant hum of the city outside. Ilana stood still for a moment after placing the invitation back on the table. The soft glow from the river reflected across the window behind her, turning the glass into a faint mirror of Chicago's skyline. She looked at her reflection again, not searching for reassurance, just observing. There was a steadiness in her eyes that hadn't always been there, because calm like that rarely appears without history. Her fingers brushed lightly across the edge of the invitation again, and for a moment, the present slipped quietly into memory. Years earlier, a much smaller apartment on Chicago's south side. Sunday evening light drifting through thin curtains, the smell of food still lingering in the kitchen after dinner. Ilana sat on the floor between her mother's knees while her mother braided her hair. It was one of those quiet rituals that didn't seem important at the time, but stayed with you long after childhood had passed. Her mother's hands worked patiently, separating strands of hair with care. "You know something about this world?" her mother asked softly. Young Ilana looked up slightly. "What?" Her mother paused for just a second before finishing another braid. "People can take a lot from you." The words weren't angry. They were calm, matter of fact. The kind of truth that comes from someone who has already lived long enough to understand how life works. They can take opportunities. They can take credit. Sometimes they can even take things you worked years to build. Ilana listened quietly. Her mother's voice grew firmer, but still gentle. But there's one thing you never give them. What's that? Ilana asked. Her mother tied the end of the braid carefully. Your dignity. She rested her hands lightly on Ilana's shoulders. Once you understand that, people can never really control you. The memory stayed suspended in the air for a moment. Then the apartment on the south side faded, replaced again by the present. Ilana blinked slowly. Back in her high-rise apartment overlooking the river, back in the present moment, the invitation still rested on the table where she had left it. Aurora Foundation Gala, hosted by Theodore. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone in Chicago's financial world knew Theodore, the brilliant founder, the man who built a tech company powerful enough to reshape entire markets. Magazines praised him, investors respected him, and rooms like the one currently filled with laughter across the city revolved around people like him. Ilana lifted the invitation again. She studied the elegant lettering, the heavy paper, the polished presentation, but something about it had felt unusual from the moment it arrived, because men like Theodore rarely noticed women like her. Unless there was a reason, and she suspected there was one, but that didn't concern her. Not really, because the gala meant something else to her, something none of them had considered. She already knew what was going to happen later that night. Not every detail, but enough to understand that the room Theodore controlled so confidently would look very different before the evening ended. Ilana placed the invitation back down again. Then she reached for the dress hanging beside the mirror. Dark velvet, elegant, graceful without excess. The kind of dress that didn't shout for attention, but when someone entered a room wearing it, people noticed. She slipped it over her shoulders slowly, adjusting the fabric until it rested naturally. Her reflection stared back at her once more, not nervous, not excited, just composed, because the memory of her mother's voice still echoed quietly in her mind. People can take a lot from you, but never your dignity. Ilana allowed herself a small smile, not because she was planning to prove anything, and not because she needed anyone in that ballroom to understand her, but because she already understood something they didn't. Tonight, a room full of powerful people believed they were inviting someone insignificant, someone they could laugh about later, someone who would walk into their world and feel small. Ilana picked up the invitation one final time and slipped it into her purse. The skyline shimmered outside her window, and somewhere across the city, Theodore was still laughing. What he didn't realize was simple. He had just invited the one person in Chicago who could change the entire atmosphere of his carefully arranged evening. And he had no idea. Sometimes the world teaches its most powerful lessons in very quiet ways. Not with shouting, not with grand announcements, just a single moment, when the truth finally steps into a room that thought it understood everything. And if you've ever been underestimated, if someone once looked at you and decided you didn't belong somewhere, then you might understand why stories like this matter. Before we continue, take a second and support the story. Tap the like button and share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing seeing how far these stories travel and the people they reach, because tonight's story is not just about money. It's about dignity, and about the quiet strength people carry when the world mistakes silence for weakness. So, if you enjoy powerful life stories that stay with you long after they end, welcome to Mr. Kingswell Stories, where powerful life lessons are shared through unforgettable storytelling. If you're new here, we're truly glad to have you. This is a place where stories aren't rushed, where every moment matters, and where real human experiences reveal the lessons many of us only understand later in life. So subscribe and join us for more inspiring stories that motivate, uplift, and open the mind. And don't forget to comment the time and where you're watching this story from. Now, let's go back to Chicago, because at this exact moment, inside the Aurora Foundation Gala Ballroom, Theodore and his friends are still enjoying the evening, still laughing, still convinced the night will unfold exactly the way they planned. They have no reason to believe otherwise. The room is filled with powerful people, influential investors, political figures, executives who have spent years building reputations that open doors before they even arrive. And in the middle of it all, Theodore stands comfortably with the confidence of someone who has grown used to controlling outcomes. His friends remained gathered near him, their drinks reflecting the soft light from the chandeliers above. One of them glances toward the entrance. "So," he says casually, "your guest coming tonight?" Theodore's smile appears slowly. "Oh, she's coming." Another man chuckles. "You actually invited her?" Theodore swirls the drink in his glass, amused. "Of course I did." The group exchanges curious looks. "And what exactly are you expecting?" someone asks. Theodore leans back slightly, relaxed. A little entertainment. A few of the men laugh quietly. Not loudly, just the confident laughter of people who have spent a long time believing that every room they enter belongs to them. What they don't realize is that somewhere across the city, a woman is finishing the final details before leaving her apartment. And when she steps through those ballroom doors tonight, everything about the evening will change. Back inside the Aurora Foundation Gala Ballroom, the evening continued exactly the way powerful people preferred their nights to unfold. Smooth, predictable, comfortable, soft jazz floated through the room, while servers moved between guests carrying trays of champagne. Conversations drifted from one cluster of people to another: markets, politics, investments, technology. It was the kind of environment where reputation mattered almost as much as money, and Theodore moved through it with complete ease. Near the bar, his circle of friends had gathered again. Men who had built fortunes in different industries but shared the same confidence that success often creates. One of them glanced toward the ballroom entrance, then back at Theodore. "So," he asked casually, "your guest coming tonight?" Theodore lifted his glass slowly. "Oh, she's coming." Another man frowned slightly. "You're serious?" Theodore nodded, amused. "I sent the invitation myself." A small laugh passed through the group. "You actually expect her to show up?" Theodore shrugged. "Curiosity is powerful." Another voice joined in. "So what exactly is the plan?" Theodore leaned against the bar, completely relaxed. "No plan," he said lightly. "Just thought it would be interesting." One of the men smirked. "You mean watching someone walk into a room like this and realize they don't belong?" Theodore's smile widened slightly. "A little entertainment never hurts." Their laughter stayed low, controlled. The kind of laughter people share when they assume the evening will unfold exactly the way they imagine. Across the ballroom, the orchestra began another slow melody. Guests continued arriving. The entrance doors opened and closed as elegant coats were handed to attendants and conversations spilled into the main hall. But Theodore's attention remained with his friends. One of them lifted his glass. "To tonight's show," he joked. Glasses touched lightly, crystal against crystal. Meanwhile, across the city, Ilana stood near the door of her apartment. The dress fit perfectly now, dark velvet falling naturally with every movement. Elegant without effort, powerful without asking anyone to notice. She picked up her purse from the table. The invitation rested inside. Aurora Foundation Gala, hosted by Theodore. For a moment she paused near the window. Chicago stretched before her like a living map of lights. The river glowed between the buildings while traffic moved slowly through the streets below. The same city where she grew up. The same city that had shaped her. And tonight, the same city where a room full of powerful people believed they had invited someone insignificant. Ilana took a slow breath, not out of nervousness, just awareness, because she understood exactly what kind of evening this would be. She slipped on her coat and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped once more in front of the mirror. Her reflection looked back calmly, steady, unshaken. For a moment she studied herself the way someone does before stepping into a moment they know will matter. Then she spoke softly, not to impress anyone, not to rehearse anything. Just a quiet observation. "Sometimes," she said gently, "people invite their own lesson." She turned off the light, closed the apartment door behind her, and stepped into the Chicago night, across the city. Inside the Aurora Foundation Gala, Theodore and his friends were still laughing. None of them realized something simple. The woman they expected to entertain them was already on her way, and before the night ended, the entire room would understand exactly who she was. Long before anyone in a ballroom wondered who Ilana was, Chicago already knew her story. Not the version that appears in magazines, not the version whispered in financial offices downtown. The real version began miles away from the polished towers of the city center. On the south side, a place where the streets carried their own rhythm and life moved with a different kind of honesty. Ilana grew up in a neighborhood where people noticed everything. Not out of curiosity, out of necessity. Neighbors watched out for one another because life didn't always give second chances to those who missed small warning signs. Children played in the streets during summer evenings while music drifted from open windows. The scent of cooking traveled through the air every Sunday afternoon as families prepared meals large enough to feed anyone who walked through the door. Ilana learned early that community meant something real there. People greeted each other by name. Doors stayed open. And when someone struggled, the entire block usually knew about it before sunset. Her home sat on a quiet street lined with small brick houses that had survived decades of Chicago winters. Inside that house, the most important lessons in Ilana's life didn't come from books. They came from her mother. Her mother believed in structure, not strictness. Structure. Dinner happened at the table. Homework happened before television. And respect was something that existed inside a person long before the outside world recognized it. Ilana watched her mother carefully as she grew up. Not because her mother demanded attention, because she earned it. There was a quiet strength in the way she moved through life. Bills were paid on time. Promises were kept. And when challenges arrived, her mother handled them with patience instead of panic. Those moments taught Ilana something important long before she fully understood it. Stability is a form of power. Sunday evenings were always the same. Dinner finished, dishes cleaned. Then the house settled into a softer rhythm. Sometimes music played from an old radio in the kitchen. Sometimes neighbors stopped by to talk for a while before heading home. But one ritual happened almost every week. Ilana sat on the floor while her mother braided her hair. Those quiet moments became conversations that shaped how she saw the world. Her mother talked about life in simple ways, not speeches, just observations. "You watch how people make decisions," her mother once said, while working carefully through another braid. "You'll learn more about them than they'll ever say out loud." Young Ilana listened closely, because even as a child, she noticed patterns. When neighbors talked about bills, she noticed how stress appeared in their voices. When someone got a new job, she noticed the relief that followed. Money decisions shaped people's lives more than most of them realized. It determined where families lived, where children went to school, whether people felt safe about the future. Those patterns fascinated her. While other children focused on games, Ilana often listened when adults discussed work, prices, and opportunities. She didn't interrupt. She observed. Her mother noticed. One evening she asked gently, "What are you thinking about so much lately?" Ilana hesitated before answering. "Why some people always seem worried about money," she said. Her mother smiled softly. "That's a big question for someone your age." Ilana shrugged slightly. "But it's everywhere." Her mother tied off the braid she'd been working on. "Understanding money helps you understand choices," she said. "And choices shape people's lives." That idea stayed with Ilana. Years later, when she entered high school, she found herself drawn to classes that explained how the world moved behind the scenes. Economics, business, anything that revealed how financial systems worked. Numbers made sense to her in a way many things didn't. Markets behaved like living systems. Patterns appeared if you watched long enough. Trends repeated themselves. And when something disrupted those patterns, opportunities appeared. By the time she reached college age, Ilana already knew what she wanted to study. Finance. Not because it sounded impressive, because she wanted to understand the forces shaping the lives she had watched growing up. College introduced her to a completely different environment. Classrooms filled with ambitious students, professors discussing global markets, case studies about billion-dollar corporations. Some of her classmates treated those conversations like competitions, everyone trying to sound smarter than the person next to them. Ilana rarely spoke during those moments. Instead, she listened. And when she did speak, her observations often surprised people. She noticed things others missed. Small financial signals, unusual shifts in company behavior, hidden opportunities inside struggling businesses. Over time, professors began recognizing something unusual about her thinking. Her instincts were sharp, not reckless, measured. She studied companies the way someone studies human behavior, looking for patterns beneath the surface. But despite her growing reputation in academic circles, Ilana never felt drawn to attention. Recognition wasn't her goal, understanding was. And quietly, without drawing headlines or applause, she began preparing for a future that very few people around her could even imagine. A future where the quiet girl from the south side of Chicago would eventually hold influence in rooms filled with powerful people who had never heard her name. Yet, by the time Alana graduated, Chicago had already taught her two important things. First, the world of money moved quietly long before headlines noticed it. Second, the people who understood those movements rarely talked about it loudly. That realization shaped the way she stepped into adulthood. Many of her classmates chased the obvious paths after finishing school. Large firms, high-profile internships, jobs where long hours and polished office spaces promised fast promotions and impressive titles. Alana chose something different. She entered the financial world quietly. Her first position wasn't glamorous. It involved long days studying market reports, reviewing company balance sheets, and learning how investment firms made decisions behind closed doors. But she loved the work. Numbers told stories. Financial statements revealed behavior. And when you watched closely enough, companies often exposed their strengths and weaknesses long before the public noticed. While others in the office talked about career moves and networking events, Alana spent most of her energy studying patterns, why certain businesses recovered after difficult years, why others collapsed even with strong public support. And sometimes when she discovered something unusual, she made a small move of her own, a quiet investment, not large, just enough to test her instincts. The first few decisions worked, then the next few, and gradually, something interesting began to happen. Her personal investment accounts started growing, slowly at first, then steadily. Alana didn't celebrate those successes publicly. She didn't post about them online or bring them up during office conversations. Instead, she reinvested, carefully. Every opportunity was examined the same way she had studied problems as a child, patiently, looking for patterns others missed. Within several years, she had built something that very few people knew about. A growing portfolio of investments spread across different industries. Some companies were small startups trying to survive their early stages. Others were established businesses that simply needed the right financial support to expand. Alana rarely attached her name directly to those investments. Anonymity offered something valuable: freedom. Without public attention, she could make decisions based entirely on strategy rather than reputation. But within certain financial circles, whispers started appearing. There was an investor who seemed to recognize promising companies long before they attracted attention, someone whose instincts were unusually accurate. People tried to identify who it was. No one succeeded. And Alana preferred it that way, because her focus had never been recognition. Her focus was understanding. Years passed. Her portfolio expanded. And one evening, while reviewing a group of struggling technology startups, she noticed something unusual. A company based in Chicago, young, ambitious, but dangerously close to collapse. Its founder had built an innovative platform that analysts believed could reshape how certain digital services operated. The idea was strong, but the company had grown too quickly. Expenses had outrun revenue. Investors were starting to panic. If something didn't change soon, the company would run out of money. Most people examining the situation saw risk. Alana saw something else: potential. She studied the company's financial records late into the night. Revenue forecasts, market behavior, product adoption. Every detail told the same story. The business itself wasn't broken. Its leadership had simply reached a point where resources were running out before the idea had time to mature. That kind of moment destroyed many startups, but occasionally the right investor arrived at exactly the right time. Alana sat quietly at her desk for several minutes after finishing the final report. The decision forming in her mind wasn't emotional. It was analytical. If the company received immediate funding and stabilized its finances, the long-term potential could be enormous. But the investment required something serious: a controlling share. Most investors would hesitate. The company was too fragile. The outcome, uncertain. But Alana understood something from years of watching markets behave like living systems. Sometimes the greatest opportunities appear when everyone else is preparing to walk away. She made the call. The investment was structured through private channels that protected her identity. The amount transferred quietly into the company's accounts was large enough to solve its immediate crisis. Employees who had expected layoffs suddenly found their jobs secure. Development teams continued working. And within weeks, the company stabilized. The founder of that company was a man named Theodore. At the time, Theodore had been younger, ambitious, and under enormous pressure. He had spent months trying to keep the company alive. When the funding appeared, relief replaced desperation almost overnight. He knew an investor had stepped forward. He simply didn't know who. The board of directors handled the negotiations privately, protecting the investor's request for anonymity, and Theodore, overwhelmed with rebuilding the company, accepted the situation without pushing for answers. Survival mattered more than curiosity. Over the next several years, the company expanded rapidly. New partnerships formed, revenue climbed, and eventually the business Theodore once feared losing became one of Chicago's most successful technology companies. Public interviews praised his leadership. Magazines highlighted his innovation. Investors celebrated his vision. Very few people knew that during the company's darkest moment, a quiet investor had stepped in and secured its future. Alana watched that success unfold from a distance, not with pride, not with regret, just quiet satisfaction that her instincts had been right. Because the investment had grown into something remarkable, the company had flourished, and her controlling stake remained exactly where it had always been. Hidden, protected, waiting. Years later, that decision would bring her into the same room as the man who had unknowingly built his success on the foundation she had provided. But for now, Ilana continued living the same way she always had. Quietly, studying opportunities, building influence without needing anyone to recognize it. And across Chicago, Theodore continued expanding the company he believed he had saved through determination alone. Neither of them realized that one evening in the future, their paths would cross in a ballroom filled with powerful people. And when that moment arrived, the truth behind their shared history would change everything. Several years after that quiet investment changed the course of a struggling technology company, Chicago's financial world had begun speaking Theodore's name with admiration. His company had grown faster than most analysts predicted. What once looked like a fragile startup had transformed into a powerful force in the tech industry. Offices expanded, revenue climbed, investors competed for access. Business magazines praised the founder who had supposedly guided the company through its most dangerous period. And Theodore accepted that praise with the confidence of someone who had learned how to succeed in public. By the time he reached his early 40s, his reputation had become part of Chicago's business identity. People recognized him in restaurants. Executives requested meetings months in advance, and invitations to elite events arrived constantly. One evening, several days before the Aurora Foundation Gala, Theodore sat in a private lounge high above downtown Chicago. The building overlooked the river, its windows offering a sweeping view of the city lights below. Inside the lounge, the atmosphere was relaxed but expensive. Leather chairs, low lighting, quiet music. The kind of place designed for conversations between people who controlled large amounts of money. Theodore's friends were already gathered around a polished table near the windows. Each of them had built wealth in different industries: real estate, venture capital, technology. Their conversations moved easily between investments, acquisitions, and the latest rumors circulating through Chicago's financial circles. A server placed another round of drinks on the table before stepping away. One of the men leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "the city's been buzzing about the Aurora Gala next weekend." Theodore smiled slightly. They always do. Half the people attend because of the charity. The other half attend because of who else is in the room. A few of the men laughed. Another friend raised his glass. "Still strange seeing your company hosting it this year." "Strange?" Theodore asked. "Not strange," the man corrected himself. "Impressive." Theodore accepted the compliment casually. The company had grown large enough that hosting the gala made sense. It placed his brand among Chicago's most influential organizations. But the conversation shifted when one of the men glanced at his phone. "Speaking of networking events," he said, "I saw something interesting earlier this week." Theodore raised an eyebrow. "What?" "There was a small investment mixer downtown. Quiet event, mostly analysts and early-stage investors." "And?" The man turned the phone slightly so the others could see a photo taken during the event. "That woman," he said. Theodore looked down at the image. A woman in a simple black dress stood near the back of the room. She wasn't trying to attract attention. Her posture looked relaxed, almost observant. It was Ilana. Theodore studied the photo for a second. "Who is she?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Name's Ilana, apparently." Someone said she was talking about market projections like she actually understood them. A few men around the table chuckled. Another leaned closer. "Look at the room she's in. That event was full of analysts and junior investors, people trying to break into bigger circles." "So?" Theodore said. So she looked completely out of place. More laughter followed. One of them added casually, "You know the type. Shows up at these events thinking they belong." Theodore leaned back slightly, swirling his drink in the glass. He studied the image again. Alana didn't look nervous in the photo. If anything, she looked patient, observant, but to Theodore and his friends, that quiet confidence was easy to misread. Another man smirked. "I'd pay to see someone like that walk into a real room of power." Theodore's expression shifted, not cruel, just amused. "You know what would be interesting?" The group looked at him. "We're hosting the Aurora Gala next weekend." Everyone at the table nodded. The event was famous in Chicago's business world. The city's most influential investors, executives, and political figures would all be present. Theodore continued, "Let's invite her." One of the men blinked. "Invite her?" Theodore nodded casually. "Why not?" Another man laughed. "You're serious?" "Sure," Theodore replied. "It might be entertaining." A few of the men leaned forward with growing curiosity. "You mean letting her show up thinking she belongs there?" Theodore lifted his glass again. "Exactly." The table erupted in quiet laughter. Not loud, just the comfortable amusement of people who had spent years believing certain rooms were reserved for people exactly like them. One of the men grinned. "That could be interesting." Theodore reached for his phone. The invitation list for the Aurora Foundation Gala was already prepared. Hundreds of names filled the document, but adding one more would take seconds. He typed quickly. An elegant, digital invitation was prepared. Formal, professional, the kind that suggested importance. Then he entered a name. Ilana. The message was sent before anyone at the table thought twice about it. Theodore placed the phone down again, smiling slightly. "There," he said. "Invitation delivered." Across the table, one of the men shook his head with amusement. "You really think she'll show up?" Theodore shrugged. Curiosity has a way of pulling people into places they don't expect. The group returned to their drinks and conversations, already imagining how the evening might unfold. None of them considered the possibility that they had misunderstood something important. Because several miles away, Ilana was sitting at a small desk in her apartment reviewing market reports when her phone vibrated softly. She glanced down at the screen. A new message. She opened it. Aurora Foundation Gala. Hosted by Theodore. The invitation sat there quietly on her screen. For several seconds, she simply studied it. Her expression didn't change, but something about the message immediately felt unusual. Because men like Theodore didn't normally notice people like her. Unless there was a reason. Ilana leaned back slightly in her chair. She thought about the event, the guest list, the environment, and something else she knew that most people in Chicago did not. The Aurora Gala would also include a major announcement involving Theodore's company, an announcement connected to a silent majority shareholder, a shareholder whose identity had never been revealed publicly. Ilana closed the message slowly. Then she allowed herself a small smile, not because she believed the invitation came from respect, but because sometimes opportunity arrives in unexpected ways, and sometimes people invite their own lessons without realizing it. She tapped the screen once. Accept invitation. The confirmation message appeared a moment later. Across the city, Theodore and his friends continued enjoying their evening, confident that the upcoming gala would unfold exactly as they imagined. They believed they had invited someone insignificant into their world. What they didn't realize was simple. They had just invited the most powerful woman connected to Theodore's company, and they had absolutely no idea. By the time evening settled across downtown Chicago, the Aurora Foundation Gala had already begun attracting attention. Black cars arrived one after another outside the Grand Hotel entrance. Drivers stepped out quickly to open doors while guests emerged dressed in formal evening wear. Some paused briefly on the steps while photographers captured the moment before they moved inside. For many of the city's most influential figures, this event was more than charity. It was visibility. The Aurora Foundation Gala had built a reputation over the years as one of the rare evenings when Chicago's financial leaders, technology founders, political figures, and media personalities gathered in the same room. Deals sometimes began in conversations like these. Partnerships formed over dinner, and reputations quietly shifted depending on who stood beside whom. Inside the hotel, the ballroom had been transformed for the occasion. Large chandeliers illuminated the space with warm light that reflected across polished marble floors. Round tables covered in white linen filled the center of the room, each decorated with tall arrangements and delicate glassware that shimmered beneath the ceiling lights. Soft jazz drifted from a small orchestra near the stage. Servers moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne, while guests greeted one another with the practiced ease of people who had attended events like this many times before. And near the center of the ballroom, Theodore moved through the room like someone completely at home, which in many ways he was. This evening carried his company's name across the invitation cards sent throughout the city. Hosting the Aurora Foundation Gala had elevated his reputation even further. People noticed when he entered a conversation. Executives straightened slightly when he approached. Several investors waited patiently for a chance to exchange a few words with him. Theodore handled each interaction with polished confidence. A handshake here, a brief conversation there, occasionally a quiet laugh when someone shared a story about the market or a new investment opportunity. He had grown used to rooms like this, and tonight the attention surrounding him felt well earned. Near the bar area, a group of familiar faces from earlier in the week gathered again around him, the same circle of wealthy friends who had laughed with him in the downtown lounge. One of them glanced around the ballroom before speaking. "You've outdone yourself this time." Theodore raised an eyebrow slightly. "With the event?" "With everything," the man replied. "Look at this room." It was difficult to argue. City leaders stood near one corner of the ballroom, speaking with business executives. Several well-known media personalities were already setting up near the back of the hall, preparing to record interviews later in the evening. And along the far wall, a small section had been reserved for members of Theodore's company board. The man continued, 10 years ago, no one imagined your company hosting something like this." Theodore smiled slightly. 10 years ago, we were just trying to survive." A few of the men nodded. Everyone in Chicago's tech world knew the story. The company had once been dangerously close to collapse during its early years. Then suddenly the financial crisis disappeared. Funding arrived. Stability returned. Within a few years, the company had grown faster than anyone expected, and now it stood among the most valuable technology firms in the Midwest. One of Theodore's friends leaned closer. "Tonight's announcement should make things even bigger." Theodore nodded. Later in the evening, the company planned to reveal a major partnership deal that analysts believed would push its value even higher. The details had been kept quiet for weeks. That secrecy had only increased curiosity around the event. Guests throughout the ballroom were already discussing the possibility. Theodore took a slow sip from his glass. "It's a good step forward," he said calmly. Another friend laughed. "That's a modest way of describing a billion-dollar move." Theodore shrugged lightly. In business, the next step always matters more than the last one. The group shared a quiet laugh. But while the conversation continued inside the ballroom, across the city, another moment was unfolding. In her apartment overlooking the river, Ilana finished adjusting the sleeve of her dress. The preparation had been simple. No rush, no anxiety, just quiet focus. The invitation had already been accepted earlier in the week, and she understood exactly where she was going tonight. The Aurora Foundation Gala, hosted by Theodore. Her reflection in the mirror revealed a woman prepared for the evening ahead. She slipped her purse over her shoulder and reached for her coat. The apartment lights dimmed as she moved toward the door. Outside, the hallway remained silent. Moments later, she stepped into the elevator and descended toward the street below. Meanwhile, several miles away, Theodore's voice rose slightly above the soft music in the ballroom as another guest joined the conversation. "The announcement will happen later tonight," he explained. "Once everyone finishes dinner." His friends nodded with interest. But just as their discussion continued, outside the hotel another car pulled slowly toward the entrance. The vehicle stopped near the front steps. The driver stepped out and walked around to open the rear door. For a moment, the night air moved quietly across the sidewalk. And then, the door opened. The black car came to a gentle stop in front of the hotel entrance. For most guests arriving that evening, the moment passed quickly. A door opened. Someone stepped out. Cameras flashed for a second or two before the next vehicle pulled forward. The staff working outside had already repeated the same routine dozens of times. But when the rear door of this particular car opened, something about the moment unfolded a little differently. Ilana stepped out slowly, placing one heel onto the pavement before rising gracefully from the seat. The evening air carried a faint chill, brushing lightly against the entrance steps as she straightened. Her dress moved softly with her as she stepped away from the car, dark velvet, elegant, without excess. The fabric reflected just enough light to reveal its shape while remaining understated. It wasn't the type of dress designed to compete with others for attention. Yet the moment she stood beneath the entrance lights, it did something unusual. It held attention. The driver closed the car door quietly behind her while she adjusted the sleeve of her coat. For a brief moment she paused, looking toward the tall glass doors leading into the hotel. Inside, warm light spilled outward, revealing movement and conversation in the lobby. Guests continued arriving around her, but several people near the entrance noticed her immediately. Not because she tried to draw attention, because she didn't. Her posture carried a natural confidence that didn't ask permission from the room around her. Ilana stepped forward toward the entrance. Each step was calm and deliberate. The hotel doors opened as an attendant greeted her politely, taking her coat before guiding her toward the ballroom corridor. The hallway leading inside was lined with polished floors and tall mirrors reflecting the movement of arriving guests. Conversations echoed softly between the walls, while music from the ballroom drifted faintly toward the entrance. As Ilana walked through the corridor, a few guests glanced in her direction. Some out of curiosity, others because something about her presence felt unexpectedly striking. She reached the entrance to the ballroom just as another guest stepped inside ahead of her. The doors opened wider, warm light flooded the hallway, and Ilana entered the room. At first, nothing changed. The orchestra continued playing near the stage. Waiters carried trays of champagne between groups of guests. Conversations flowed across the ballroom in small clusters. But then someone near the entrance looked up. The man paused mid-sentence while speaking with a colleague. His eyes followed Ilana as she stepped across the marble floor. A woman standing nearby turned as well. Then another. Moments like this often begin quietly. One person notices something unusual. Then two. Then five. And gradually, attention spreads through a room before anyone realizes it is happening. Ilana walked further inside the ballroom. The chandeliers above reflected softly across the polished floor as she moved. Her pace remained steady, not slow enough to appear cautious, not fast enough to appear nervous, just natural. Near the balcony, a group of guests paused their conversation as she passed. One of them leaned slightly toward the other. "Who is that?" he asked under his breath. The other shook his head. "I'm not sure." More eyes began turning. People scanned the room briefly before returning their attention to the woman crossing the floor. Something about her presence created quiet curiosity. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. But it carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who already believed she belonged wherever she chose to stand. Near the center of the ballroom, the music softened as the orchestra transitioned between songs. For a moment, the change in sound created a brief pause in the room's rhythm. During that pause, the attention surrounding Ilana grew stronger. More guests noticed. Conversations slowed. Some simply watched her pass. Others whispered to the person beside them, "Do you know her?" "I don't think so. She must be important." Because in rooms like this, people assume something simple. If someone moves with that level of ease among powerful guests, they must belong there. Ilana continued walking calmly through the ballroom. She didn't rush toward the center of the crowd. She didn't search for attention. Instead, she moved toward the quieter side of the room, observing the environment with quiet awareness. Her eyes moved briefly across the tables, the stage, and the clusters of conversations happening throughout the hall. Every detail told her something. The layout, the people, the subtle hierarchy forming around certain groups, and somewhere across the room, Theodore finally noticed the shift in the atmosphere. At first, he didn't see what caused it, but he noticed people turning their heads. Small conversations pausing, guests looking toward the same direction. He followed their attention across the ballroom, and then he saw her. For a brief moment, his mind struggled to connect the image with the small photograph his friend had shown him days earlier. Because the woman standing inside the ballroom now looked very different from the person he had casually dismissed during that conversation. Not louder, not extravagant, just impossible to ignore. Near him, one of his friends leaned slightly forward. "Wait," the man said quietly. "Is that?" Another friend narrowed his eyes. "That's her." Theodore remained silent for a second longer, watching. The moment he had imagined all week was supposed to unfold very differently. He expected awkwardness, uncertainty, someone clearly out of place in a room like this. Instead, the woman standing inside the ballroom looked completely comfortable, and that unexpected detail unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Ilana had reached a table near the edge of the ballroom. She paused there briefly, taking in the environment around her. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then the orchestra began playing again, and the conversations slowly returned. But the energy inside the ballroom had shifted, because now everyone had seen her, and a quiet question had already begun moving through the room. Who is she? From where Theodore stood, the ballroom suddenly felt different. Only a few minutes earlier, the evening had followed the usual rhythm of events like this. Conversations flowed easily. Laughter rose and fell between groups, and the soft music near the stage filled the space between voices. Now something had shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. More people were glancing toward the same side of the room. More conversations paused halfway through a sentence, and the quiet curiosity moving through the ballroom felt stronger with every passing moment. Theodore followed the direction of those glances. That was when he saw her clearly for the first time. Ilana stood near one of the tables along the outer edge of the ballroom. Her posture was relaxed, her attention moving across the room with quiet interest, as if she were simply observing the environment around her, not searching for approval, not trying to attract attention, just present. One of Theodore's friends leaned slightly closer. "That's her," the man said quietly. Another friend looked again, surprised. "No way." Theodore didn't respond immediately. He studied her for a moment longer. The image in his mind from earlier in the week had been very different. Back then, when his friend showed the photograph from the small investment mixer, she had looked like someone easy to dismiss. Ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. But the woman standing in the ballroom now carried herself with a presence that didn't match the picture he had formed in his mind. Another friend spoke again. "She actually came." A faint smile returned to Theodore's face, though it held a touch more curiosity now. "Well," he said lightly, "we did invite her." The men around him exchanged glances. One of them chuckled softly. "This should be interesting." Theodore set his glass down on the nearby table. "Stay here," he said. Then he began walking across the ballroom. The crowd parted slightly as he moved through the room. Several guests greeted him along the way, offering quick handshakes or brief comments about the event. He acknowledged each of them with the practiced ease of someone used to public attention, but his focus remained on the woman standing near the edge of the ballroom. Ilana noticed him approaching long before he reached her. She had been observing the room carefully since entering. It was easy to recognize which person held the most influence in a space like this. People watched Theodore. They adjusted their posture when he joined their conversations, and the small circles forming around him made it clear that this evening revolved around his presence. Now he was walking toward her. Ilana remained where she stood. When Theodore reached the table, he offered a polite smile. "Miss Ilana," he said smoothly, "you actually came." His tone carried the faintest hint of amusement, not overtly disrespectful, just enough to suggest that her presence still surprised him. Ilana met his gaze calmly. "You invited me." Her voice was steady and natural, without defensiveness. Theodore studied her expression briefly. Most people in her position would have shown some sign of nervousness by now. A forced laugh, a hesitant smile, some small signal that they understood the imbalance of status between them. But Ilana displayed none of those reactions. She simply stood there, composed. Theodore tilted his head slightly. "I wasn't sure you would accept the invitation." Ilana glanced briefly around the ballroom before answering. It seemed like an interesting evening. Her response made Theodore pause for a moment. Interesting was not the word he expected. Behind him, his friends had begun drifting closer, curious to observe the exchange. One of them spoke first. "So, you're Ilana?" She turned toward him politely. "Yes." The man smiled, though his curiosity was obvious. "We heard you've been attending some investment events around the city." Ilana nodded. Occasionally, another friend folded his arms lightly. "And what exactly do you invest in?" The question sounded casual, but its meaning carried a quiet challenge. What could someone like you possibly be doing in rooms like this? Ilana didn't hesitate. "Companies." The man raised an eyebrow. "That's a broad category." She gave a small shrug. "Opportunities rarely limit themselves to one industry." A few nearby guests who had begun listening to the conversation exchanged brief glances. The answer was simple, but confident. Theodore watched her carefully. Something about her responses continued to defy the moment he had imagined when sending that invitation. He had expected awkwardness. Instead, she seemed perfectly comfortable. One of his friends tried again. "So which firms do you usually work with?" Ilana picked up a glass of water from the table before replying. "I prefer to remain flexible." She took a small sip before setting the glass back down. "Markets change quickly." Theodore smiled again. "You sound experienced." Ilana returned the smile politely. "I pay attention." For a brief moment, silence settled between them. Theodore realized something then. The joke he expected to enjoy wasn't unfolding the way he planned. The woman standing in front of him wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't scrambling to prove she belonged. She simply behaved as if she already did. One of his friends leaned closer and murmured quietly to Theodore, "This isn't going the way you expected." Theodore ignored the comment. Instead, he looked directly at Ilana again. "Well," he said, "I hope you enjoy the evening." She nodded slightly. "I'm sure I will." At that exact moment, the music near the stage softened. A voice echoed across the ballroom through the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, dinner will begin shortly. If you could please make your way to your assigned tables." Guests throughout the room began moving toward their seats. The quiet tension surrounding Theodore and Ilana dissolved as the rhythm of the event resumed. But something subtle had already changed, because Theodore found himself glancing at Ilana once more as the crowd shifted around them. The moment he had expected to control now felt slightly different, less predictable, and somewhere deep in his mind, a small question had begun forming. Who exactly had he invited into this room? The announcement that dinner was beginning moved through the ballroom like a quiet signal. Guests gradually shifted from standing conversations toward the large circular tables arranged across the room. Chairs were pulled back, jackets adjusted, glasses placed carefully beside folded napkins. The atmosphere softened slightly as people settled into their seats. Moments earlier, the ballroom had been filled with movement. Now it carried a calmer rhythm. Waiters began arriving with the first course, while low conversations spread between the tables. Ilana took a seat near the outer section of the room, not at the center where the most visible guests gathered, not near the stage either. Just one of the tables where smaller groups of attendees had been placed together. From there, she could see much of the ballroom without attracting attention. Her chair faced toward the center of the room, where Theodore remained standing with several guests. For a moment, she simply observed. Dinner events like this followed patterns. Certain people gathered near the stage, certain conversations attracted attention, and certain guests quietly measured the room before deciding who was worth speaking with. Theodore eventually made his way toward the head table near the stage. But before sitting down, he glanced briefly across the ballroom. His eyes landed on Ilana again. She sat calmly among the other guests at her table, listening to a conversation unfolding beside her. Something about that detail caught his attention. She wasn't looking around nervously. She wasn't scanning the room in awe the way many first-time attendees did. She appeared completely comfortable. One of Theodore's friends noticed where he was looking. "That's your guest," the man said quietly. Theodore nodded. "Yes." The friend smirked slightly. "You're still planning to enjoy this evening, right?" Theodore gave a small smile. "Of course." Then he picked up his glass and moved away from the head table. Instead of sitting down immediately, he walked across the ballroom again, toward Ilana. Several nearby guests noticed his movement. When someone like Theodore approached a table during an event like this, people paid attention. Conversation slowed slightly as he arrived beside Ilana's table. "Good evening," he said politely to the group seated there. A few guests greeted him with quick smiles. Then Theodore turned toward Ilana. "Miss Ilana," he said, "I hope the evening hasn't been overwhelming." His voice sounded courteous, but beneath the words sat a quiet suggestion, the kind that implied she might not be used to rooms like this. Several people at the table looked toward her, curious how she would respond. Ilana lifted her glass of water calmly. "Not at all," she said. Her tone carried no defensiveness, just a simple answer. "I've attended events like this before." Theodore tilted his head slightly. "Really?" Ilana nodded. "Several times." A faint pause settled over the table. Theodore had expected hesitation. Instead, her answer sounded completely natural. One of the guests at the table chuckled softly. "Well," the man said, "this is certainly one of the larger events in the city." Ilana glanced briefly around the room. "Yes," she replied. "It's very well organized." Her comment sounded genuine, not sarcastic, and somehow that made the moment more uncomfortable for the people who expected awkwardness. Theodore folded his arms lightly. "You follow the business world closely, then?" Ilana met his gaze. "I follow opportunities." Another short pause settled across the table. Nearby guests had begun paying closer attention to the conversation, not openly staring, but listening. Theodore studied her expression carefully. Most people in her position would try to impress him, mention connections, highlight achievements. Instead, Ilana answered every question in the simplest possible way, without exaggeration, without apology. Theodore tried again. "And what brings you to events like this?" Ilana set her glass down gently. "Curiosity." Theodore raised an eyebrow. "Curiosity?" "Yes," she said. "Rooms like this are interesting." That answer caught him off guard. "How so?" Ilana glanced briefly across the ballroom. "Because decisions made in rooms like this often affect people who will never see them." Her voice remained calm, but the observation carried weight. Several guests exchanged brief looks. Theodore leaned slightly closer. "That's a thoughtful perspective." Ilana gave a small shrug. "It's simply something I've noticed." Another pause settled over the table. The moment Theodore had imagined earlier in the week continued refusing to appear. There was no awkward silence, no embarrassment, no sign that Ilana felt uncomfortable. Instead, the conversation had quietly shifted in her favor. One of Theodore's friends approached the table at that moment, clearly curious. "How's the evening going?" he asked. Theodore glanced toward him. "Quite well," he said. But inside his mind, something unexpected had begun forming, because the small experiment he planned for the evening was not unfolding the way he expected. And as guests around the table continued observing Ilana, another realization slowly began moving through the room. The woman many assumed would feel out of place didn't look out of place at all. Dinner continued with quiet elegance. Plates were placed carefully in front of guests. Silverware moved softly against porcelain. Conversations rose and fell across the ballroom in a steady rhythm. At Ilana's table, the atmosphere carried a different kind of energy. Not tense, but attentive. People nearby had already noticed the brief exchange between her and Theodore. The conversation hadn't gone the way anyone expected. Instead of shrinking under his subtle remarks, she had answered calmly, almost thoughtfully. That alone had created curiosity. Theodore's friend who had approached earlier remained standing beside the table, studying Ilana with a slightly amused expression. "So," he said after a moment, "Theodore mentioned you follow opportunities." Ilana looked up from her plate. "Yes." The man pulled a chair slightly closer, resting one arm on its back. "What kind of opportunities?" The question sounded casual, but the intention beneath it was obvious. He wanted specifics. Something that would reveal whether her earlier answers had been confidence or simply clever conversation. Ilana dabbed her napkin lightly against the corner of her mouth before answering. "Mostly companies that show strong potential." Theodore's friend smiled faintly. "That's still a broad description." Ilana nodded. "Opportunities rarely present themselves in only one form." Another guest at the table leaned forward with interest. "You mean startups?" "Sometimes. Public companies?" "Occasionally." Her answers remained simple, clear, but carefully measured. Theodore watched quietly from his position beside the table. He had expected this moment. Eventually someone would push the conversation further. That was the point of inviting her. One of his other friends joined the group standing nearby. "I'm curious," the man said. "How long have you been investing?" Ilana considered the question briefly. "Several years. Self-taught?" he asked. "I studied finance." The man nodded. "That explains the confidence." Ilana smiled politely. "I prefer preparation." Theodore's friend chuckled softly. "Well, preparation helps, but the financial world is complicated." Ilana met his gaze calmly. "Yes," she said. "It is." Another pause followed. Theodore could feel the conversation slowly shifting direction again. The questions were becoming more pointed. One of the guests seated at the table spoke next. "Have you worked with any companies we might recognize?" Ilana folded her hands lightly on the table. "Possibly." The man laughed lightly. That's mysterious. Alana shrugged slightly. Discretion is useful in finance. A few people at the table exchanged amused glances. The answer had avoided the trap without sounding defensive. Theodore leaned slightly closer. So you prefer staying behind the scenes? Alana turned toward him. It allows clearer decisions. How so? Public attention often influences judgment, she said. Anonymity removes that pressure. Theodore studied her expression again. She spoke about the subject as if it were something she had experienced directly, not as a theory, but as a practical strategy. His friend continued pressing. Still, the man said, investing at the level we're discussing usually requires significant capital. Alana nodded. That's true. And access. Yes. The man smiled. So where does that access come from? Several guests at the table leaned slightly closer. The question had become direct now. Alana picked up her glass again, taking a small sip before answering. Relationships, she said. Built over time. The man raised an eyebrow. With who? Alana set the glass down carefully. People who recognize potential. Her voice remained steady. There was no attempt to impress anyone. Just quiet certainty. One of the seated guests chuckled softly. You answer questions like someone who has been in the industry for a long time. Alana smiled faintly. Experience teaches efficiency. Across the table, Theodore found himself studying her more carefully. The questions had been designed to expose uncertainty, to create the moment of discomfort he originally imagined. Yet each answer had done the opposite. Instead of weakening her position, the conversation was gradually strengthening it. People around the table were no longer looking at Alana with curiosity alone. Now they were listening. Theodore noticed something else as well. Her tone never changed. No frustration, no defensiveness, just steady responses. Eventually his friend leaned back in his chair. Well, the man said, you certainly sound confident. Alana nodded slightly. Confidence is useful. And you believe you understand the markets? Alana glanced briefly toward the center of the ballroom before answering. I believe markets reveal themselves if you watch carefully. That answer lingered in the air for a moment. Even Theodore's friend seemed to pause. The statement wasn't arrogant, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent years studying the subject. Theodore straightened slightly. You're an interesting investor, he said. Alana looked at him. Thank you. Then she added calmly, markets are interesting teachers. Another short silence settled across the table. For reasons Theodore could not fully explain, the conversation had begun to shift in a way he had not predicted. He had invited her expecting entertainment. Instead, he found himself increasingly curious. Finally, he glanced toward the tall windows along the side of the ballroom. Beyond the glass, the night stretched across the city. He looked back at Alana. Would you like some fresh air? He asked. She studied him briefly, then nodded. That would be nice. Theodore gestured toward the nearby balcony doors. The two of them stood and stepped away from the table. Behind them, several guests watched with quiet interest. Because the evening's most unexpected conversation had just moved somewhere more private, the balcony doors closed softly behind them. Inside the ballroom, the music and conversations continued, but outside the sound faded into the background. The night air carried a cool freshness that felt completely different from the warmth inside the crowded room. Alana stepped toward the railing and rested her hands lightly on the smooth metal surface. Below them, the river moved steadily through the heart of Chicago. Lights from nearby buildings reflected across the water while cars crossed distant bridges in slow lines. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Theodore stood beside her, watching the city. He had stepped outside, expecting to regain control of the conversation. Instead, he found himself thinking about everything she had said during dinner. Her answers had been calm, measured, nothing exaggerated, and that had unsettled him more than if she had tried to impress him. Finally, he broke the silence. You handled my friends well. Alana glanced toward him briefly. They were asking questions. They were trying to challenge you. Alana gave a small shrug. That happens in business conversations. Theodore studied her expression. You didn't seem bothered. Should I have been? Theodore paused. Most people would have been. His friends were known for testing newcomers in social situations like this. It was a habit developed from years of working in competitive industries. Yet Alana had responded as if the questions were completely normal. He leaned lightly against the railing beside her. You know, he said, when I invited you tonight, I expected something very different. Alana looked back toward the river. I suspected that. Theodore turned his head. You did? Yes. How? She smiled slightly. The invitation arrived unexpectedly. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. No, she agreed. But people usually invite others to events like this because they already know something about them. She paused for a moment. You didn't? Theodore laughed quietly. That's fair. He looked out across the city again. I'll admit something, he said after a moment. Go ahead. I thought you might feel uncomfortable tonight. Alana didn't respond immediately. Instead, she watched the lights reflecting across the river. Rooms like this don't bother me, she said eventually. Why not? Because rooms don't create power. Theodore frowned slightly. What do you mean? She turned toward him. Power comes from decisions. The simplicity of the statement made him pause. You sound like someone who has spent a lot of time studying leadership. Ilana gave a small smile. I've spent a lot of time studying outcomes. Theodore leaned back against the railing again. I started my company because I wanted to build something meaningful, he said. Ilana listened quietly. At the time, he continued, I had very little experience running a business. I just believed in the idea strongly enough to try. And it worked. He nodded. Eventually, she noticed the slight emphasis in his voice. Eventually, she repeated. Theodore gave a small laugh. You probably know the public version of the story. Most people do. The early years were difficult, he admitted. Alana remained silent. She already knew that part of the company's history better than he realized. There was a point, Theodore continued, when I thought everything was about to collapse. His voice carried a trace of memory now. Investors were pulling back. Expenses kept rising. The entire operation felt like it was about to fall apart. He shook his head slightly. Then suddenly funding appeared. Alana watched him carefully. It gave us the breathing room we needed to keep going. And the company recovered. Yes, Theodore exhaled slowly. To this day, I still wonder about that investor. Alana's expression remained neutral. You never met them? No, never asked. At the time, survival mattered more than curiosity, he admitted. Later, the board said the investor preferred privacy. Alana looked back toward the city. That's understandable. Theodore studied her face again. Why finance? He asked suddenly. Ilana rested her hands lightly on the railing. Because I grew up watching how financial decisions shaped people's lives. He waited. In my neighborhood, she continued, one good decision could lift a family forward, and a bad one could hold them back for years. Her voice remained steady. I wanted to understand how those decisions worked. Theodore nodded slowly. That's a powerful reason. What about you? She asked. Why technology? He smiled faintly. Because I believed ideas could change how people live. And you proved it. Sometimes, he said. The two of them stood quietly for another moment. The city moved below them without noticing the conversation happening above. For the first time that evening, Theodore felt something unfamiliar. Not curiosity alone. Respect. The woman he had invited as a joke had turned out to be someone he genuinely wanted to understand. Inside the ballroom, the sound of a microphone crackled briefly. Then a voice echoed faintly through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please return to your seats. Theodore glanced toward the doors. That must be the announcement. Ilana nodded. Sounds like it. He pushed himself away from the railing. Shall we? She stepped back toward the doors beside him. Together, they returned inside the ballroom. Neither of them realized that the next few minutes would reveal a truth capable of changing the entire atmosphere of the room. Because the announcement waiting inside wasn't just about Theodore's company. It was about the person who had quietly shaped its future long before tonight. And the entire room was about to learn her name. The moment Theodore and Ilana stepped back into the ballroom, the atmosphere had already begun shifting. Guests were returning to their seats. The orchestra had finished its final song of the dinner service, and the quiet conversations filling the room slowly softened as attention moved toward the stage. At the front of the ballroom, a microphone stood waiting beside the podium. Theodore recognized the signal immediately. The announcement was about to begin. He glanced briefly toward Ilana as they walked back toward the dining tables. Looks like the evening is moving to the next part, he said. Ilana nodded slightly. Yes, There was nothing unusual in her voice, just quiet acknowledgement. They reached the edge of the ballroom floor as the microphone crackled softly. A man from the company's board stepped forward. He adjusted the microphone and looked out across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began. The conversations faded almost instantly. Events like this always included speeches, but tonight carried a little more anticipation than usual. Guests throughout the ballroom knew that Theodore's company planned to reveal an important business announcement. Many expected it to involve a major partnership or acquisition. Some had even speculated about the possibility of a billion-dollar deal. The board member allowed the room to settle before continuing. "Thank you all for joining us this evening in support of the Aurora Foundation." A brief wave of polite applause moved through the ballroom. He smiled and waited for it to fade. "This organization has spent years supporting innovation and opportunity throughout Chicago." More applause followed. Theodore stood near one of the front tables, listening with relaxed confidence. Speeches like this were common at events hosted by large companies. The board would thank donors, highlight achievements, and then transition into the major announcement. Everything about the moment felt routine, but the board member's next sentence shifted the tone of the room slightly. "Before we discuss the company's future," he said, "there is something important about its past that deserves recognition." Theodore frowned faintly. That line had not appeared in any of the prepared remarks he had reviewed earlier. The board member continued speaking. 10 years ago, this company faced one of the most difficult periods in its history. Guests exchanged curious looks. Most people in the room knew that Theodore's business had grown rapidly in recent years. Very few knew how close it had once come to collapse. The board member's voice remained calm. At that time, the company was struggling to survive. Theodore felt a small knot of confusion forming in his chest. He hadn't expected this part of the story to be discussed tonight. The board member continued. Revenue had not yet caught up with development costs. Investors had begun stepping away. The future of the entire operation had become uncertain. The room had grown completely silent now. Some guests leaned slightly forward in their seats. Theodore folded his arms slowly. He remembered those months clearly. They had been exhausting. Long nights, difficult decisions, constant pressure to keep the company alive, but the speech was revealing details he had never publicly discussed. Then something unexpected happened, the board member said. A single investor stepped forward. Theodore's brow tightened. That moment had always remained a mystery to him. The board member paused briefly before continuing. This investor provided the financial support necessary to stabilize the company during its most fragile period. A quiet murmur spread across the ballroom. Theodore shifted his weight slightly. He had always known the investment existed, but the board had handled the negotiations privately. All he had ever been told was that the investor preferred anonymity. For years, the board member continued, this individual requested complete privacy. Guests throughout the ballroom began whispering softly. A mysterious investor saving a struggling startup was an intriguing story on its own, but revealing it during a major gala suggested something more significant. The board member rested his hands lightly on the podium. And tonight, he said, that story reaches a new chapter. Theodore felt his attention sharpen. This was no longer the routine speech he had expected. Across the room, Alana sat quietly at her table, watching the stage. Her expression revealed nothing unusual, just quiet attention. The board member looked across the ballroom once more before speaking again. Because the person who saved this company, he paused, did more than provide temporary support. Guests leaned forward slightly. The silence deepened. They became its most significant investor. Theodore felt confusion spreading through his thoughts. He knew about the investment, but the board had never described the details in those terms. The board member took a slow breath before finishing the sentence. And tonight, we believe it is time for the entire room to understand exactly who made that decision. The ballroom held its breath, because the mystery that had quietly surrounded Theodore's company for a decade was about to be revealed. The silence in the ballroom grew heavier after the board member's last sentence. People shifted slightly in their seats. Some leaned toward the person beside them, whispering quietly. The story he had just begun revealing had caught everyone's attention. Most guests had arrived expecting a standard charity gala, followed by a business announcement. Instead, they were hearing something very different, a hidden piece of history connected to one of Chicago's most successful companies. The board member allowed the quiet curiosity to build before continuing. As many of you know, he said, investments come in many forms. His voice carried clearly across the ballroom. Some investors provide temporary funding, others support companies during expansion phases. He paused briefly, but occasionally, someone chooses to take a much larger risk. Several people nodded slightly. Theodore watched the stage with growing confusion. He remembered the moment the investment had appeared years earlier. At the time, it had felt like a miracle. The company had been weeks away from shutting down. Then suddenly, the financial crisis disappeared. Employees kept their jobs. Development continued. The company survived. But Theodore had never learned the full story behind that decision. The board member continued. The investor we are speaking about tonight did not simply stabilize the company. He looked out across the audience. They made a long-term commitment. Guests were now watching with complete attention. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others folded their hands quietly while waiting for the next sentence. The board member spoke again. They acquired a controlling share of the company. That statement changed the entire atmosphere of the room. A controlling share meant something serious. Ownership, influence, authority. The quiet murmurs spreading through the ballroom grew louder for a moment. Because if someone held a controlling share of Theodore's company, that meant they technically possessed greater financial authority over the company than anyone else, including Theodore himself. Theodore felt his thoughts tightening. He had known an investor saved the company, but controlling ownership had never been explained to him that clearly. The board member raised his hand slightly, encouraging the room to settle again. For 10 years, he continued, this individual chose not to step into the spotlight. The murmurs faded. While the company expanded and Theodore's leadership gained recognition, this investor remained quietly in the background. Theodore's expression hardened slightly. He was still trying to understand why the board had never explained the situation more openly. Another guest whispered nearby, "Who could it be?" The question spread quickly through the room. A secret investor with controlling shares could only mean one thing: someone powerful, someone wealthy, someone connected to the financial world at the highest level. The board member continued speaking. During those years, the board respected the investor's wish for privacy. He glanced briefly toward Theodore, but recently, after careful discussion, the investor agreed that tonight would be the right moment to share the truth. The entire ballroom seemed to lean forward. People began quietly scanning the crowd, searching for clues. Some glanced toward well-known business figures sitting near the front tables. Others studied the groups gathered near the stage. The assumption was simple. The person behind such an investment must be someone famous, someone already recognized in the financial world. The board member rested his hands on the podium again. This person did not ask for recognition, he said. They did not request public praise. He paused. They simply believed the company deserved another chance. Theodore felt a strange tension building inside him. The speech had turned the entire room into a place of suspense. Even he now wanted to know the answer. Who had taken that risk? The board member looked out across the audience one more time. And tonight, he said calmly, we would like to thank that person properly. The room had become so quiet that even small movements sounded louder than usual. Someone adjusted a chair. A glass touched lightly against the table. Then the board member raised his arm. Would the investor please stand? For a moment, nothing happened. Guests turned their heads slowly, searching for movement somewhere in the ballroom. Some people looked toward the front tables. Others scanned the crowd near the back of the room. Theodore watched carefully, his attention moving across the same groups. Whoever this investor was, the moment had finally arrived. Several seconds passed. Then, the board member shifted his gaze. His eyes moved toward a table along the outer section of the ballroom, toward the place where Ilana sat quietly. A few nearby guests noticed the direction of his attention first. Then others followed. And suddenly, dozens of heads turned in the same direction. Theodore felt his heartbeat slow for a moment. Because the board member was looking directly at Ilana. She had been sitting calmly at the table, her hands resting lightly in front of her. Now, every person in the ballroom seemed to be watching her. For a brief moment, the entire room remained frozen. Then Ilana gently pushed her chair back and stood. For a brief second after Ilana stood up, the ballroom felt completely suspended in time. No one spoke, no one moved. The only sound in the entire room was the faint hum of the sound system still carrying the echo of the board member's last words. Guests stared. At first, some of them simply looked confused. They turned toward one another, as if expecting someone nearby to explain what they were seeing. But the board member remained standing at the podium, watching Ilana with quiet acknowledgement. And that silent confirmation was enough. A ripple of stunned whispers began spreading across the ballroom. People leaned toward the person beside them. Is that? No way. That can't be right. Across the room, Theodore had not moved. His eyes were fixed on Ilana. For a moment his mind refused to connect the two realities standing in front of him. The woman who had just risen from the table, and the mysterious investor the board member had been describing. They could not possibly be the same person. But the board member spoke again, his voice calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the investor who believed in this company when few others did." He extended one hand slightly toward Ilana. "Is Ilana?" The whispers exploded into a wave of stunned conversation. Guests who had spent the evening trying to determine who she was now realized the answer had been standing quietly among them the entire time. Several people stood halfway from their seats in disbelief. Others stared at Ilana with widened eyes. Theodore remained frozen where he stood. Because the realization hit him all at once, every piece of the evening suddenly rearranged itself inside his mind. The calm way she had answered his questions, her quiet understanding of the financial world, the confidence that never seemed forced, it all made sense now. Ilana had not been visiting rooms like this as a curious outsider. She had been shaping companies from behind the scenes for years, including his. Across the ballroom, the board member continued speaking. For 10 years, Ilana chose not to step forward publicly, he explained. She believed the company's success should belong to the people building it every day. The murmurs in the room slowly shifted. Confusion began turning into admiration, because the story now sounded very different from what people first imagined. A woman who had quietly saved a company, then stepped back and allowed others to receive recognition for its growth. That kind of decision carried a different weight. Ilana stood calmly beside her chair. She did not rush. She did not look around nervously. She simply waited until the room began settling again. Then she stepped forward. The movement was small, but it instantly drew the attention of everyone watching. People moved their chairs slightly aside to create space as she walked. The sound of her heels touched the marble floor softly with each step. Theodore watched her approach the stage, the same woman he had invited as a joke, the same woman he had expected to feel uncomfortable in a room like this. And now the entire ballroom understood that she was not only comfortable here, she had quietly held more influence over Theodore's company than anyone in the room. Ilana reached the stage and stepped beside the podium. The board member moved aside, allowing her to stand at the microphone. The applause began slowly. A few people clapped first, then others joined. Within seconds, the entire ballroom filled with the sound. It was no longer polite applause. It was genuine. Because the story they had just witnessed felt extraordinary, Ilana waited patiently until the applause softened. Then she looked out across the room. Her expression remained calm. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the speakers. "I didn't expect tonight to become about me." A few people in the room smiled. She continued. "When I first looked at Theodore's company years ago, I saw something promising." She glanced briefly toward Theodore. "A strong idea." Her gaze returned to the audience. But strong ideas sometimes arrive before the resources needed to support them. Several guests nodded. Anyone familiar with startups understood that reality. Ilana rested her hands lightly on the podium. "So I made an investment." The simplicity of the sentence almost made people laugh softly, because the decision she described so casually had changed the entire direction of Theodore's company. She continued speaking. "I didn't do it for attention." Her voice remained steady. "I did it because I believed the company deserved time to grow." The ballroom remained completely silent. Everyone listening now understood the deeper meaning of the story unfolding in front of them. Ilana paused briefly before finishing. Then she spoke the sentence that would stay with people long after the evening ended. "I also came tonight because someone invited me as a joke." A quiet wave of uncomfortable laughter passed through parts of the room. Ilana allowed the moment to settle before adding one final line. "But life has a way of reminding us." Her eyes moved toward Theodore. "To be careful who we underestimate." For a moment, the entire ballroom remained silent again. Then the applause returned, louder than before. People rose from their chairs. The standing ovation spread across the room until nearly every guest was on their feet. Theodore stood among them, clapping slowly, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. because the woman he had tried to embarrass that evening had just revealed herself as the most powerful person connected to his company, and standing there on the stage, Ilana looked exactly the same as she had earlier that night. Calm, unshaken, as if the entire moment had unfolded exactly the way she expected. The applause continued longer than anyone expected. Guests remained standing around the ballroom, their attention fixed on the stage where Ilana stood beside the podium. For many of them, the moment felt almost surreal. Only minutes earlier, she had been another guest sitting quietly at a table near the edge of the room. Now everyone understood that she was the investor who had quietly shaped the future of Theodore's company. The applause gradually softened, though the energy in the room remained strong. Ilana stepped away from the microphone and returned to the floor. As she moved through the crowd, people instinctively made space for her. But something else had changed as well. The expressions on their faces. Earlier that evening, many guests had watched her with curiosity. Now they approached with genuine respect. Several guests extended their hands as she passed. "Congratulations," one said. "That was remarkable," another added. Ilana acknowledged each of them politely. "Thank you." Her responses remained simple. She didn't linger in long conversations. She simply accepted the moment with quiet grace. Across the ballroom, Theodore stood among the crowd. His hands had stopped clapping several seconds earlier. He was still watching Ilana. But now, his thoughts had turned inward. Everything that had happened during the evening replayed in his mind. The invitation, the jokes he had shared with his friends, the assumption that she would feel uncomfortable in a room like this. And now the truth stood clearly in front of him. The woman he had tried to embarrass had quietly held more influence over his company than anyone else in the room. A strange mixture of emotions moved through him. Shock, embarrassment, and something deeper, perspective. He had built his reputation around confidence, but tonight had revealed a blind spot he had never fully noticed before. He'd underestimated someone who deserved respect long before the gala even began. Across the room, Ilana continued speaking with a few guests who had approached her after the announcement. Her posture remained relaxed. Nothing about her behavior suggested she felt victorious. If anything, she looked exactly the same as she had earlier in the evening. Theodore noticed that detail immediately. Someone else in her position might have used the moment to command attention, but Ilana seemed almost uninterested in the spotlight. That realization made him reflect even more, because the quiet power she carried felt very different from the kind of influence he had spent years chasing. The crowd slowly returned to their seats. Dinner plates were cleared away. Conversations resumed, though the subject had changed completely. Guests were now discussing the revelation they had just witnessed. Some admired the story. Others seemed surprised that someone with so much influence had remained anonymous for so long. Meanwhile, Theodore stepped away from the center of the ballroom. He needed space. The noise of the room had begun feeling overwhelming. Without speaking to anyone, he moved toward the balcony doors he had used earlier that evening. When he stepped outside, the cool air greeted him again. The city stretched out beyond the railing, lights glowing steadily against the night. For a few moments, he simply stood there, thinking. The balcony had been the place where his earlier conversation with Ilana began. Back then, he had believed he understood the situation. Now he realized how little he actually knew. He rested his hands on the railing and looked down toward the river. Success had shaped his life in powerful ways. It had opened doors, created opportunities. But somewhere along the way, it had also created assumptions. Assumptions about who belonged in certain rooms. Assumptions about who understood the world of finance. And tonight, those assumptions had been completely dismantled. Behind him, the balcony door opened quietly. Theodore didn't turn immediately. He already knew who had stepped outside. Ilana walked toward the railing beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The same quiet space where their earlier conversation had unfolded now carried a completely different meaning, because the balance between them had changed, and Theodore understood something clearly now. The most important conversation of the evening had not happened yet. The balcony felt quieter now than it had earlier in the evening. Inside the ballroom, conversations continued, and glasses clinked softly as guests resumed their celebrations. But outside, the air carried a calm that allowed every thought to settle more clearly. Ilana walked toward the railing and stood beside Theodore. The city stretched before them again, lights glowing across the river and distant buildings. From this height, the movement of traffic looked almost peaceful. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Theodore kept his eyes on the skyline, gathering his thoughts. The silence between them did not feel uncomfortable. It felt honest. Finally, he exhaled slowly. I owe you an apology. Ilana turned her head slightly toward him. Her expression remained calm, but she did not interrupt. Theodore continued. When I invited you tonight, it wasn't with the right intention. He paused briefly before finishing the thought. I assumed things about you. The admission seemed simple, yet it carried weight. For a man used to confidence and control, saying those words required humility. Ilana rested her hands lightly on the railing. That happens often, she said quietly. Theodore looked at her. You knew. Yes. How? She smiled faintly. Your invitation arrived out of nowhere. That doesn't prove anything. No, she agreed. But people rarely invite strangers into rooms like that without a reason. Theodore nodded slowly. That's fair. He rubbed the back of his neck, reflecting again on the moment earlier that week when he had sent the invitation. At the time it had seemed harmless. Now it felt very different. I thought the evening would be entertaining, he admitted. Ilana raised one eyebrow slightly. Entertaining? Theodore gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. I believed you might walk into the ballroom and realize you didn't belong there. Ilana studied him carefully. And now? Theodore looked down at the city lights below. Now, I realize I had no idea who I was inviting. The honesty in his voice changed the tone of the conversation. He was no longer trying to control the moment. He was acknowledging the truth. Ilana looked back toward the river. You weren't the only one in that room who made assumptions tonight, she said. Theodore frowned slightly. What do you mean? Many people there believed the same thing. That you didn't belong. Yes. Theodore shook his head slowly. After what happened on that stage, no one believes that anymore. Ilana did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the quiet movement of the city below. Recognition changes how people see things, she said eventually. But dignity shouldn't depend on recognition. Theodore turned toward her. That sounds like something you've believed for a long time. She nodded once. My mother used to say it often. The memory softened her voice slightly. She believed people could take many things from you in life. Theodore listened carefully. But dignity, Ilana continued, is something you choose to keep. The words settled between them. Theodore thought about everything that had happened earlier that evening. The jokes he had shared with his friends. The assumptions. The moment when the board revealed her identity, and the calm way she had handled it all. You could have humiliated me tonight, he said quietly. Ilana glanced at him. That wasn't the goal. You had every reason. Maybe. Theodore leaned against the railing again. So, why didn't you? Ilana considered the question before answering. Because embarrassing someone rarely teaches the lesson you want them to learn. Theodore absorbed that slowly. And what lesson was that? That people deserve to be understood before they are judged. Theodore nodded. I learned that tonight. His voice carried sincerity now. I spent years building a company and believing I understood how the business world worked. Ilana remained silent, allowing him to continue. But tonight reminded me of something important. What's that? Success doesn't automatically make someone wise. Ilana smiled slightly. Wisdom usually arrives later. Theodore laughed quietly. That explains a lot. For a moment, the conversation relaxed. The tension that had existed earlier in the evening had transformed into something more thoughtful. Then Theodore looked at her again. You saved my company, he said. Ilana didn't respond immediately. Yes, she said after a moment. And I never even knew. That wasn't necessary. It feels necessary now. Ilana studied his expression. For the first time that evening, she could see genuine humility in him. Not the polished confidence of a successful entrepreneur. Something quieter, more reflective. Theodore extended his hand toward her. I'm sorry, Ilana. The apology carried no performance. Just sincerity. Ilana looked at his hand briefly before shaking it. Apology accepted. The moment felt simple. Yet something important had shifted. The man who had invited her as a joke had finally seen her clearly, and the lesson of the evening had reached its most meaningful point. Inside the ballroom, applause rose again as guests continued celebrating. But on the balcony, a quieter realization had taken place. Theodore had built a powerful company, yet the most valuable lesson of the night had nothing to do with business. It had everything to do with character. For a few moments after the apology, neither of them spoke again. The air on the balcony carried a quiet stillness that felt very different from the energy inside the ballroom. The sounds of celebration continued behind the glass doors, but out here the evening had slowed down. Theodore leaned against the railing, watching the river below. It felt strange realizing how quickly the entire night had shifted. Only a few hours earlier, he had been laughing with his friends about inviting Alana to the gala. At the time, the idea had seemed harmless. A small moment of amusement in an evening designed for networking and celebration, but the night had unfolded very differently. Instead of embarrassment, the room had witnessed something far more meaningful, a quiet reminder that influence and dignity often arrive without announcing themselves. Theodore looked toward Alana again. She stood beside the railing, her attention moving calmly across the skyline. The applause and admiration inside the ballroom did not seem to affect her. She appeared exactly the same as when she first stepped out of the car earlier that evening. Grounded, thoughtful, present. "You know," Theodore said after a moment, "I spent most of tonight trying to figure you out." Alana glanced toward him. "And did you succeed?" "Not completely." She smiled slightly. "That's honest. But I realized something," he continued. "What's that?" "The way you handled everything tonight." He paused briefly, searching for the right words. "Most people in your position would have enjoyed the moment a little more." Alana raised an eyebrow. "You mean embarrassing you?" Theodore chuckled quietly. "That's one way to put it." She turned slightly toward him. "That wouldn't have accomplished much." "Why not?" "Because people rarely learn anything from humiliation," she said. "They learn from reflection." Theodore nodded slowly. "That explains why you stayed calm when the board revealed the truth." Ilana looked back toward the city. "I had already made peace with my decisions years ago." "And the company?" "Yes." Theodore rested his hands on the railing again. "You took a major risk back then. I saw potential, and you were right." She gave a small shrug. "Sometimes patience is more valuable than speed." Theodore smiled faintly. "That's a lesson." Many entrepreneurs learn the hard way. For a moment the conversation drifted into silence again, but this time it felt lighter. The tension that had existed earlier in the evening had disappeared. Something else had taken its place. Respect. Theodore turned toward her once more. "Would you be open to something?" Ilana studied him. "That depends." He laughed softly. "Fair answer." Then he continued. "I'd like to have dinner with you sometime." Ilana looked at him thoughtfully. "We just attended a dinner event." "I mean a real one," Theodore said. "No speeches, no announcements, no audience watching every word." He paused briefly. "Just a conversation." Ilana considered the idea. Earlier in the evening she had expected nothing from Theodore except a lesson he needed to learn. Now the situation felt different. He had listened. He had acknowledged his mistake, and that mattered. "What would we talk about?" she asked. Theodore smiled. "Probably the same things we talked about tonight. Business, life, and dignity." He nodded. "That seems like an important topic." Ilana looked toward the ballroom doors behind them. Inside, the celebration continued. Guests were still discussing the revelation about the company's mysterious investor. Stories were already forming. People would talk about this evening for a long time. Finally, she looked back at Theodore. "One dinner," she said. His expression brightened slightly. "That's fair." After that, she added, "We'll see." Agreed. The two of them stood there for a moment longer, the quiet understanding between them settling naturally. Inside the ballroom, guests were beginning to prepare for the rest of the evening's program. But something had already happened that would travel far beyond the walls of the hotel. By morning, the story would move across Chicago. People would talk about the gala, about Theodore's company, about the mysterious investor who had finally stepped into the spotlight. But the part of the story people would remember most wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about a lesson. A woman who walked into a room where people expected her to feel small, and instead reminded everyone present of something simple. True influence does not shout. It does not demand recognition, and it certainly does not need to prove itself to anyone. True power walks quietly into the room, and when the moment arrives, the entire room understands. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Sometimes people are judged too quickly, and stories like this remind us to look deeper before deciding someone's worth. And if you enjoy storytelling that teaches real lessons about life, respect, and resilience, subscribe to Mr. Kingswell Stories. We'll see you in the next story.